Okay, so welcome to another interview for the Zero to ASIC course YouTube channel, and I'm very happy today to be joined by Ed Conway. How are you doing, Ed?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, for people who don't know who you are, maybe you can give us a little bit of a background about you.
Yeah, my day job is I'm a journalist. I'm the economics and data editor at Sky News. I also write a fair bit in various newspapers, and yeah, I kind of like. I guess I'm not the obvious expected person to be kind of writing about stuff like semiconductors, but randomly, because I wrote this book just recently called Material World, which is trying to look at the world from various unusual perspectives of how we get stuff out of the ground and turn it into amazing things. Then semiconductors became, a big obsession of mine for a little while. But I'm kind of like I'm an interested amateur rather than an expert like yourself.
Yes, although you did get quite a lot of great access, which I think is very interesting. So you visited some of these sites, didn't you?
Yeah, well, that's a nice thing about being a journalist, is that people often let you in. Although the interesting thing, again, with semiconductors is that people are kind of understandably a little bit nervous about having visitors, because this is a really contested industry,
Secrecy.
and there's so much secrecy, and you know that, and when you go in, there are certain bits they might want to show you and might not want to show you, and certain bits they might not want to talk about. And that's kind of, to me, one of the interesting things about this is that, the modern age as we know it is kind of built on these little marvels of engineering in our pockets. But being able to make them is incredibly difficult, and being able to make the materials that go into them is really difficult as well. And so that's one of the things I kind of wanted to try to talk about. I think it's one of the most incredible things that humankind has ever achieved, to be able to produce nanotechnology and not just do it in the lab. That's the interesting thing. You're doing it. Yeah. So the billions hold these things in their pockets. With repeatability and scale, and as you've shown, when you go to a fab, it's about the yield. It's about how many chips you're actually getting out of each wafer that actually work. Is a manufacturing process. We kind of forget that, and I think a lot of the big message of this book, which is partly about semiconductors, is one big chapter, is basically. We kind of think that things just kind of turn up. We take it for granted. We think we live in this slightly ethereal universe where, all that matters is kind of having a good idea. But actually being able to make stuff, being able to take stuff, turn it from inert pieces of stone into something amazing is A, pretty extraordinary. B, it's often very energy intensive, so it involves quite a lot of carbon emissions along the way. And C, we to some extent have just outsourced a lot of that to other countries around the world, and therefore we're starting to lose our capability of doing this stuff ourselves in much of the West. So, yeah, it is a very interesting kind of moment right now, and semiconductors are right at the heart of geopolitics, and that is kind of unsettling for a lot of people working in the field. But it's also really exciting.
Yeah. So I want to touch on that a little bit later on, but let's get started with your book. So Material World, the first chapter. So I really recommend, if you've not checked it out, then check out the book. It's really good. And the first chapter is all about sand.
Yes.
And not just semiconductors. There's also a very interesting part on making concrete and cement, all these things that also depend on sand.
Yes. And glass, which is so fascinating as well.
Yeah. And you say in the book that glass is the oldest thing that humans have made. And semiconductors are like the newest, most cutting edge thing that humans make.
Yeah.
So I think there's this nice journey. And one of the things that I learned from your book is that, in fact, we don't start from sand. There's a lot of these videos on YouTube that's like sand to silicon, but actually you can't use sand because it messes up the smelting process. So in your book, you start off with this mine in Spain, where I'm based at the moment. And we're like mining a very, very pure quartz, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I wanted to not just in trying to tell the story of how we make stuff. I wanted to take my smartphone and just literally understand physically where the silicon actually came out of the ground. And I went and talked to a lot of people within the silicon, within the semiconductor world, people who work in fabs and so on, chip design, the whole thing, and kind of asked a lot of them, well, okay, it's all very interesting, and I do want to understand about FinFETs and 2 nanometer processes and all of this, but I also kind of just want to understand where the silicon comes from. And a lot of people would just say, oh, it's just sand. And then I kind of tried to go trace that journey through from the quarry, wherever this supposed sand comes out of the ground, all the way through to it becoming a silicon wafer, through to then when it enters the fab. And the startling thing was, like, actually, as far as I could work out, no one had tried to do that before. And a lot of people I spoke to along this supply chain didn't really have the foggiest about what was going on at the other end of it. So it turns out, as you say, when you're making metallurgical silicon, which is the precursor to polysilicon, which is itself the precursor to making the silicon wafer, there's loads of stages, it turns out, and it's complex and it's kind of amazing even before you get to the semiconductor foundry. But when you're kind of taking that metallurgical silicon, when you're making it, you can't just put sand into the furnace that you're using. And by the way, the process is basically stick your silicon into a furnace. So this is the silicon oxide that comes out of the ground, silica. You stick it into a furnace, you stick it alongside wood chips and coal. By the way, coal is one of the ingredients you use to make it because it's a smelting process, a lot like smelting iron. And then you burn it at really high temperatures. In fact, it's like an electric arc furnace, so it's almost like lightning bolts are going on inside there. Literal, actual lightning bolts are happening inside these. And the issue with sand is there's nothing wrong with its chemical kind of ingredients. The issue is if you put it in there, then it would kind of, the convection forces that are kind of going on there, and there is all sorts of different kind of chaotic forces inside there, would mean that the sand lifted up and it gummed up the filters, basically, which are used to try and extract some of the fumes and the heat. So sand just won't work just for pragmatical kind of engineering reasons rather than anything more highfalutin than that. Yeah. And you need big kind of fist-sized chunks of what they call quartzite, which is basically sand, but it's just, crystallized into this quartz form. So actually your silicon chip begins with a material that is used for work surfaces rather than sand. It's no more or less poetic, but it is an interesting thing that people at the top end, and like you say, there are lots of these presentations out there, including from places like Intel, saying it all begins with sand, which is just wrong because, that's not how you make metallurgical silicon, which is in turn what you need to make silicon wafers.
The chemical
it's kind of interesting.
Is correct, but the
composition's fine. It's the structure. Yeah.
Okay, so now we've got our 99.9% pure metallurgical silicon that is then smashed up into pieces, and then that's moved
about
to
98. I think it's 99.8 or something like that. So it's pretty pure by most people's standards. Yeah.
And then that's taken to another company that then does the polysilicon, right? Like you mentioned in the book, a company called Wacker.
Yeah, Wacker, a German company, and this is one of them. And what I try to do, so actually, a lot of this is happening in China. But what I tried to do was try and explain the different processes. And there are only so many places outside of China which are doing it. It so happened that at the time I was writing the book, it was COVID, and so I couldn't get into China, even if they would have let me in anyway. But so you've made this metallurgical silicon, as it's called. I know it's not a metal. A lot of people, when you say metallurgical silicon, people are like, "Oh no, silicon is not a metal." Well, people within the trade call it metallurgical silicon, and it looks like a metal. And obviously, it's a semiconductor. It's somewhere in between, isn't it? And that then gets carted off to a factory where it undergoes a totally new process to make it even purer. And the process that's usually used is something called the Siemens process. And it kind of involves essentially vaporizing that metallurgical silicon that you've got and then reforming it almost atom by atom in these big kind of high pressure machines. Where at the end, the kind of end product, it looks a little bit like the kind of furred up lime scale you get on a kettle, like an old kettle that had these kind of parts. And then that what looks like the Ferdot limescale is actually super pure silicon. So it's what you're trying to do is make it from 99.9% or a bit less percent pure into 99.999999, sometimes 8 nines, sometimes 10 nines. You're making it super pure so that basically there is nothing but silicon atoms in there. It's one of the purest things that humankind has ever made. So that's the Siemens process. And then that's polysilicon.
10 nines purity, so that's like one at the absolute limit. So that's one impurity for every 10 billion silicon atoms.
That's right. Like that. Yeah, exactly. It's crazy. It's crazy kind of amount.
Head around it. Yeah.
It's hard to wrap your head around, except to say this is one of the purest things that we are capable of making. You know, it is so pure, but it takes a lot of work to get there. That's a really energy intensive process. Yeah, and that's polysilicon, and so that's step 2.
Yeah, and this is something that has changed. Like we've had the demand for higher and higher purity has changed over the years because, as you say in the book, when the semiconductor industry started, the shapes what we were making were so much bigger that the process would tolerate a little bit of impurity. But now, when you're building structures where you're potentially only hundreds of atoms wide, if there's even one atom of impurity within those 100 atoms, that transistor might not work.
Exactly. So it's just dimensions. It's just dimensions. Yeah. And if you're measuring it in atoms or in angstroms or whatever you might be measuring it in, but you're getting down to that kind of level, then one lone rogue atom is enough to mess up a circuit. And so it matters. Yeah, it's kind of crazy, isn't it?
But we're still not ready because that silicon is polysilicon. So it's all, the crystal structure is all jumbled up and doesn't make sense. And one thing that I learned when I visited the IHP fab is they have this machine that rotates the wafers so that there's a little notch at the bottom and all the notches line up. And I said, why is that important? And it turns out not only is it important that the crystal structure is completely perfect, but it's in the right orientation so that when they do the processes on the machine, the crystal is always lined up with the machine.
Yes.
So what do we do to convert that polysilicon into the crystalline silicon that we need?
Yeah, so you've got your silicon, and it is, and I'm not a material scientist. I'm a journalist, so you know, my expertise is trying to explain.
You're a temporary expert.
I hopefully get them right. Having spoken to lots of people who genuinely are experts, but you know, if there's a mistake that creeps in, you can correct me. So basically, you've got your polysilicon. It's so pure, but it's a wodge of different crystalline structures, and you need to create something that is the perfect atomic structure. So that think of like eggs lined up neatly in their packing case rather than being higgledy-piggledy all over the place. So it's not just purity, you need crystalline structure, a monocrystal structure. And that's where you go through a new process called the Czochralski process. This guy, I just about got there, Czochralski. This guy I spoke to actually who works in the Czochralski process, he said he had to look up how to pronounce it. He works doing it, but he had to look up how to pronounce it because everyone there just calls it CZ because this is a US company. Yeah. So they basically, you melt down your polysilicon in a super pure crucible that is also itself made of a super high type of quartz. We can get back to that if you want to. You melt it down, and then you get a seed crystal, okay, and then you pull up that seed crystal slowly, turning it, rotating it along the way. And what forms beneath it is what's known as a boule. It's like this big, long, quite heavy sausage almost, or you know, of silicon. And just because of the way that it is pulled up, it is a perfect crystalline structure. Okay, so that's the Czochralski process. It happens at this stage because you're genuinely worried about impurities. You're so worried about impurities. Everything's happening in a vacuum. I think in like an argon atmosphere. Inside these kind of, so inside this kind of super pure environment, and what results is the thing that that you've probably seen, which is those long kind of boules, which is like a kind of sausage, almost like a salami of silicon, except it's not salami. It's the purest thing in the world. It's purest, but it's also got the most perfect atomic structure. I think it's actually the most perfect thing. It's the most perfect thing that humankind is capable of making, or certainly it's up there. And then that's sliced away. So you've got this long thing, and then that's sliced away into very, very thin slices, and each of them cylindrical. And that cylindrical nature is just because of the nature of the Czochralski process. It's because you're pulling it up and turning it along the way, and you're pulling it out of this crucible. So it just happens to be round. And that thing that is sliced at the end, that is your silicon wafer. And by now, those atoms that came out of the mine, the one I looked at was in Spain. These kind of finding the quartzite, it's not every country has quartzite, but it's not like it's totally rare. But that silicon has been around the world potentially a few times. It has certainly had a massive set of energetic transformations to turn it into a silicon wafer.
Yeah.
And this is all before the wafer has got to the fab.
When I was reading the book and I was counting, it seemed to me like it had been turned from a liquid back to a solid 3 different times.
I think that's right, yeah. And I think actually in some of the Siemens process, I think it also kind of gets vaporized. So I have no idea whether it's actually kind of almost becoming gaseous at some point along the way. There's some very silane, which is kind of like, I think, a gaseous form of silicon that it becomes. But all is to say, we kind of do fixate, understandably, because that's where a lot of the know-how is and a lot of the value added is in what's happening at TSMC or Intel or wherever it is in the fab. But by the time it's got there, you've had so much work going on in it. And it's not easy to do this stuff. There's only so many factories in the world that can do the Czochralski process. And there's only so many places that can do the Siemens process and get you up to 10 nines. And China, although they've put a lot into this, and they're probably getting there now, certainly at the time I was researching this, most people who were in the silicon wafer business were saying China is not there yet in terms of making the super purest, the most pure things. And obviously, like you're saying earlier, Matt, if you're going to make a 2 nanometer dimension semiconductor, you do need 10 nines. You need something that's super pure. So it's kind of amazing stuff.
Yeah, it's incredible, and I really like the kind of tip of the iceberg story, because it, as you say, it's kind of the sexy part is the lithography. Then everyone focuses on AMSL and the incredible lithography steppers, but you can't do that until you've got the silicon wafer in the fab, and there's this enormous story that is like not really well spoken of. There is one great video I'd recommend people watch, which is by Asianometry, and it's called The Humble Silicon Wafer, and it talks a lot about these processes. But there's still all this other story about the mining and the fact that it's not sand, and it's the bigger chunks of silicon that I only learned from reading your book.
And the people at the mine, in the same way that the people in the fab don't really know where their silicon comes from, the people in the mine, a lot of them don't really know or actually care that much that the piece of rock that they're just pulling out of the ground is going to end up as a part of a smartphone. Because that same piece of rock could end up as part of a kitchen work surface, and their job is done when it leaves the mine, and that's that, and that I guess is the wonder of modern markets, where a lot of people just do their job, and somehow what eventuates is an extraordinary bit of technology. But it's quite nice to occasionally have this view all along the supply chain, because then that means that you can pick up your smartphone and say, well, a bit of this began as a lump of rock that was pulled out of the ground. It seems like it's kind of in Spain, or indeed somewhere around the world. That's what I find kind of exciting about it.
Yeah. So I think I want to talk a little bit more about the supply chain stuff. But if you're watching this video and you're interested in what happens after the wafer gets to the factory, then check out my recent factory tour to IHP in Germany, where I visited a factory and saw what happens to actually get the MOSFETs on the wafer. So I
recommend it. I watched it and enjoyed it.
Thanks, Ed. I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about the kind of the darker side. So. And this is one of the things that comes up in your book as well, is that we don't really talk about emissions or pollution. But one of the figures you gave in the book is just to get to that first stage of purity, the 99.8%, is 3,000 times the energy cost of cement. Do you have any idea of the amount of energy it takes to like actually end up with the final silicon wafer? Because you're having to go through this melting and recrystallization process 3 different times. It must be a huge amount of energy input.
There's a couple of papers. The striking thing is that people have only really started to try to count this quite recently. So I was quite surprised that that you couldn't really very easily find the carbon footprint of a silicon chip, but people have been working on that. In fact, there's a paper. I'll send the link so that we can kind of add it to this to the notes here, where people are now starting to work that out. In short, though, it is a lot of energy going into kind of making metallurgical silicon, and in turn making that into the silicon wafers that we then end up using. And then it's also quite a lot of energy at the fab as well. And also the water footprint is quite high. As you know, there's lots of water used at fabrication plants. And so it is very energy intensive. And obviously, if you're using coal for a lot of that energy conversion, which, certainly in China people are, then it's going to be really carbon intensive. And as I was saying, you actually, in a chemical sense, you can't. Right now, we don't have a good way of taking quartzite out of the ground and processing it into metallurgical silicon without using coking coal. So you actually have to use coal, not just to power the furnace. Actually, that coal is used for chemical reasons, because the coal, in the same way as coking coal is really good at making iron, so taking iron ore and turning it into pig iron, which is like a much purer form of iron. The coal there is basically doing the job of grabbing the oxygen atoms off the ore and then taking them and kind of punting them out of the chimney in the form of carbon dioxide.
Taking the silicon dioxide and turning it into the silicon.
Exactly. Yeah. It's the same thing with so you still need coal for that. And so right now we don't really have a good way of making silicon chips without actually at least some embodied carbon emissions that are both energetic, okay, so the gas or whatever you're using to power these furnaces, and also chemical. And that's the trickier bit. Like one of the subjects, as you know, I look at in the book is concrete. Trying to solve how we make concrete without carbon emissions is going to be one of the biggest things in terms of getting to net zero, because you just can't make cement, which is the main ingredient in concrete. You can't make it without big carbon emissions. Not from about half of the carbon emissions come from, again, like I say, from that chemical process. Getting oxygen out, and using carbon is a really good way of doing it, because it just happens. Carbon's brilliant at certain things. So anyway, the long and the short of it is that it is quite similar to making steel. Making the silicon that goes into these chips is quite similar to making steel. However, we're doing it at far, 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 far smaller quantities than we are doing for steel. So per chip, it's going to be pretty small. The carbon footprint, and given how small those chips are, the carbon footprint per weight of chip is relatively small. Probably a greater footprint is things like server costs. In the long run, we're going to have to kind of wrestle with that. Particularly as AI becomes more important and intensive, the amount of global carbon emissions that come, and energy
costs for running a computer.
The energy cost of running a computer and running servers and cloud services is really high. It's about 1% of global energy consumption right now, and it's probably going to go up quite a bit.
It'd be interesting to see where the breakdown is of like the energy used like to make the chip, and then the energy the chip uses during its lifetime.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And again, I think people are starting to get there, but the striking thing is that's a really recent thing. It is a really people have been looking at carbon emissions for other things for a while, but I just don't think people have been spending much time thinking about how these processes happen, and therefore what the environmental cost is something that's only kind of started to be looked into more recently.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about supply chains in general. I, as far as I know, the supply chain, because we just talk at the moment we're just talking about silicon wafers, but there's all these other important chemicals that are also needed as part of the semiconductor industry. And then once you've got the chips in it, you've got to do something with them. So then you've got the PCBs, you've got the assembly, you've got to put it in a product, and then you're finally ready to sell it. So do you think that the semiconductor supply chains are the longest in the world?
They are definitely among the longest that I've encountered. Because, like with other
I haven't
things,
seen anything I think is longer, but I've not.
no,
I
I
don't
don't.
know.
I don't. I think they must be, and see, it's not just length; it's also the kind of depth of it. So, at each stage, like you're saying, at each stage, it's not just the company doing the Czechowski process that's involved. You know, they have their own
Own
providers of,
suppliers, yeah.
yeah,
Like you can
their
go
own
down the rabbit hole
suppliers.
with AMSL, and they're the people that supply the lasers or the
Exactly.
lenses. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
So yeah, with ASML, you can go down that rabbit hole, and then it's the same thing with going down the rabbit hole of the people who make the machines that allow you to do the Czechowski
yeah,
process, which is the
yeah,
equivalent of ASML for
yeah.
that particular field. And it's the same thing with the people who make the crucibles that allow you to do the Czechowski process.
Yeah.
That's a particular type of company. There's an American company actually that is not, maybe not the global monopoly for that, but there's an American company which is very big in that. I think they're called Linton.
Sibylco?
Well, so there's Sibelco, who are the
Sibylco.
company who get it out of the ground. So there's only
Okay.
one mine. This is the other kind of mind blowing thing.
Yeah.
There is only one mine in the world. Well, it's kind of like one area with two companies working on it. One mine, which is in North Carolina, a place called Spruce Pine. It is the one place they have found in the world that has large enough quantities of high purity quartz that you can be used in the crucibles, which are allowing you to do this Czechowski process. So it's not like the silicon. It is actually sand, as I understand it. It's not like that sand ends up in your silicon chip, but you need that sand to provide the crucible for your silicon chip to be made, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because if that crucible has any impurities in it, then that will leach into the melt.
Precisely, and you can only, I think up until recently, you're only really able to use that crucible one time. So each new time you were making a new silicon boule, you had to have a new crucible, and that sand all had to come from Spruce Pine. And like I say, there's one place where you can get it from in America, and there's only a small handful of companies capable of making the crucibles, and one of those is I think this one called Linton, and they're all quite secretive. And I spoke to as many people as I could, but a lot of people, there's a bit of kind of cloak and dagger about it, because why would these people talk to anyone else when they've got the global monopoly for X?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one I don't know if you know, but if we can make silicon up to 10 nines purity, can we not also do the same thing with the crucibles? Why does it have to be mined from this one such specific mine?
I think you probably could in practice. It's just that it would just be, it would just cost a hell of a lot more. Right. And so, the big thing you're doing there in terms of cost and focus is it's making the silicon chip. And if you're then suddenly having to kind of devote as much of your attention to making the crucible in which it's going to be made, then the cost of your silicon chips is going to multiply potentially, because you're having to do so much extra work. So like a lot of this stuff, and this is a striking thing, I've looked across all of these different materials. So like copper, there are other things which are better conductors of electricity than copper, like silver. And you could get kind of, nanotubes. You can get nanomaterials which are better conductors of electricity than copper. But you've got to think about, whether you can't just replace the entire world's wiring with graphene. It would be like incredibly expensive and difficult, and also graphene's not that good for, in other ways. Copper's quite good in other ways. And so part of this is also a pragmatic thing. Concrete is not just an amazing building material. It's also kind of really cheap. And it's really easy to make. Like, it's easy to mix and lay concrete, and that's why it's taken over the world. Iron is just really, really good at what it does. It's not the strongest thing in terms of its kind of, by weight, but it's just, we know how to make a shed load of it, and we do. And so you kind of encounter these things to change the world. It's not just good enough to kind of make something in a lab and for it to be really good. And we can make really good things in a lab, and they're amazing. You just need for it to be able to be disseminated amongst everyone. And that's certainly what we do with semiconductors. And that's so yeah. What your question is a good one. I imagine you could probably synthesize a lot of this stuff, but could you then kind of have as many chips as you kind of needed to keep the world economy going? Maybe not.
If the price of the wafer doubled, what would that do to the end result?
Exactly. exactly.
Yeah. So I think a good place to end on is talking about the idea of sovereign supply chains. So we've seen like this enormous investment in 2023 with the CHIPS Act in the US and the EU, combined $100 billion investment. And part of this has come out, as you said at the beginning, from the kind of concerns about the global supply chain and how vulnerable it is to a single pinch point. For example, once the wafers arrive to be made, there's like only a few places that make the cutting edge logic processors. I mean, only 30% of chips are logic for servers or for iPhones or whatever, right, but they're all made in Taiwan in TSMC. And there's just this one tiny island that can do it. So there's been this, one of the reasons of this huge $100 billion investment is wanting the EU and the US wanting to have kind of supply chain sovereignty. Do you think that that's an achievable goal?
I mean, I think is the short answer. I just don't see how it is. It is such a complex supply chain. It has so much, not just length as we were discussing, but that depth. So, there are definitely thousands, tens of thousands potentially of different companies from many different countries around the world that are engaged in this. Whether it's when you're looking at who's providing the chemicals that are then going into your kind of, abrasion processes in your fab, who's providing the different machinery, who's providing each of the different parts that go into it. There's such a multiplicity of different types of expertise that are located in many different parts of the world that I just think it would be nigh on impossible to locate everything in a single country. And that's not really the way that the world has ever worked. We have definitely had different blocks before. So you have the Cold War where there were these supply chains didn't bestride the whole globe, but they bestrode kind of continents and areas. And like-minded allies, and we may well move to that kind of a world. And it's certainly also the case that when you look at these supply chains, the one country which has the most of the stuff is actually America. So clearly the US doesn't have it has not yet cracked 2 nanometer processors. Intel hasn't yet cracked 2 nanometers or indeed 3 nanometers. It hasn't worked out EUV. But it will presumably at some point. And when you look at those multiplicity of different companies all along the supply chain from the quarry through to the very end, the US is pretty well placed compared with China, compared with most other parts of the world. But by the same token, it would still need to get ASML machinery, and that comes from the Netherlands. The ASML machinery has lenses made by Zeiss in Germany. It has lasers made by Trumpf, which is also a German company. And when you're looking at these things, they are tapestries of different technologies from all over the world. So I just think it would be nigh on impossible. And that's before you consider the economic cost of trying to take so much expertise that is built up in a certain place and try and replicate it. That is such an expensive operation to do. So I think it would be very difficult indeed. But that is the kind of logic of, the politics right now is a lot of people are talking about reshoring. The interesting thing when you look at what's actually happening, whether it's for computer chips or elsewhere, is quite a lot of that reshoring has mostly been talk rather than action, and we're yet to see dramatic changes. That's not to say it won't manifest in the coming years, because these are slow-moving processes. And certainly with energy, with things like battery manufacture, the US is very, very determined to try to bring a lot of that back. But with things like chips, I can well imagine how you might have like-minded allies being able to share enormous supply chains, much as you did during the Cold War. But I just can't see how it all could be in one country, even in the US.
Okay, fantastic. Very interesting conversation. Thank you, Ed. And if you're interested in understanding more about the complex tapestries that we all depend on for our daily lives, then I really recommend giving Ed's book a read. It's called Material World, and you can get it from wherever you get your books from. So thanks again, Ed. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.